Everyone for joining us tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about being a landlord, tips, tricks, and executions. To begin, Alex, again, and everyone, just want to share some little legal matter. Please don't take anything from this presentation as legal advice. This presentation is solely based on our experience and what we believe to be the best practices through knowledge that we've gained over the last 10 years as a real estate investor and landlord. That's Alex. You should be saying that.
I should be. I don't know why you're taking my thunder here, but yeah, if you can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, just a little bit about myself. Thanks, Carmelo. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Alex Zhvanetskiy. I'm a realtor of Remax Condos Plus. I've been in the condo space in the Greater Toronto area for over a decade now. I first started working in the space as senior executive for a company that provided services for condominiums, and then transitioned into becoming a real estate agent. I've been an investor since 2013. I have holdings, I guess, properties throughout Ontario, Alberta, multifamily, single family, short-term rental. So that's kind of where I got the idea for this presentation, because as a real estate agent, I do assist people in finding tenants for their properties, managing properties, and then also I just incorporate the things that I do for myself as as an investor into the way that I assist my clients with screening tenants and kind of troubleshooting any challenges that come up. And yeah, if you want to scan that QR code, there is some links there. My social media is there. My Instagram is just basically my first name and last name. And yeah, so basically just who's going to benefit from this presentation. So this is a very entry-level type of presentation. So it's mainly tailored towards people in Ontario, but I believe that some of this is transferable. I'm just for things like giving tenants notices of rent increase. I don't know what the procedure or policy is in other provinces or in the US. I just know how it is in Ontario. But generally, this is geared towards newer landlords, those that are either thinking about purchasing a property and self-managing it, or those who are thinking about purchasing a property and having a property manager manage it. I think that anybody who's kind of just starting to dabble in this or thinking about getting into this would benefit from some of the information that I'm going to share. And this is going to be recorded. It is being recorded currently. We are going to be sharing it on YouTube as well, and we'll be sending the link out later this week for anybody who wants to watch the recording. But yeah, if you have questions, we can answer them at the end. But if it's a really pressing question, you can just raise your hand. We can address it in real time. But chances are some of the questions are going to be addressed throughout the presentation. Carmelo.
So the topics we'll be covering in this presentation, finding and screening tenants, managing the day-to-day expectations with the tenant, know your rights and understand the tenant's rights when it comes to leasing out a property, and also common procedures to navigate and renting, rent increases, property damages, tenants moving out, making sure to hire, I've learned with regards to my experiences, when you're looking at getting renting out a place, it makes a lot of sense to hire a qualified person, third-party experts to help vet the process.
Yeah, or especially if you get into any legalities with your tenant, it's kind of important to understand what are issues that you can just address yourself, or you can research yourself. There are really good resources online, like the Ministry of Labor website, like the Residential Tenancy Board website that offers free information. There's also a 1-800 number that you can find. They can also give them a call and answer some questions. But it's also about kind of knowing when to tag in the experts, when to call a paralegal. Generally, it's paralegals in Ontario that handle legal matters with landlords and tenants, just because they're so costly that it doesn't really make sense to hire a lawyer, and a lot of it either is dealt with through the Landlord Tenant Board or through small claims court. And yeah, I'm just going to kind of share, like, the first part of the presentation is just finding and screening tenants. So I'm just going to share some of my own best practices. So, when you're finding tenants, you can do it yourself. There are good resources available online where you can post rental ads, on websites like Facebook Marketplace, on Kijiji or Craigslist. If you have a condo, there are some buildings that are really in demand that I see where people, if they're living in a place and the landlord is selling the property, they want to move somewhere else, they want to stay in that building. So sometimes posting just even on the notice board downstairs in your condo might be a good way to get tenants. But you can also, and I find that in the GTA, most condos are advertised through real estate agents on the MLS. And it's basically something that happens between realtor and realtor. So a landlord hires a real estate agent to help them find a tenant, advertise the property, provide photography, create the listing. And then other agents come with their tenants to see the property and then put forth an offer to lease the property. And then the landlord's agent would then kind of deal with that offer, do pre-screening, provide advice, guidance, answer questions, do background checks, and kind of do all the legwork. But there is a fee for it. So it's a pretty standard fee in Ontario. It's 1 month rent plus HST. Half of it goes to the listing brokerage, half of it goes to the cooperating brokerage that brings the tenant. So if you want to do it yourself, you definitely can. I recommend you treat it as almost as a job interview. You're watching for red flags, you're watching for things that don't make sense. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what to watch for as in the next couple of slides. But if you want to just hire a professional to do it for you, you could always hire a real estate agent and have them list and pre-screen and kind of go through the process, even up to the key exchange. I mean, this works well, especially if you don't live in proximity to where the property is. Hiring an agent out there or maybe a property management company to do that for you could be quite beneficial. But also just like even understanding the market, right? Because you might go on Facebook Marketplace and you may see a certain rent amount, but a real estate agent may be able to help you to better determine what the market rent for your property is. And in many cases, it could be a higher market rent. So you could be potentially leaving money on the table if you're just kind of going to be going into it yourself. It is also a negotiation that happens between qualified tenants and landlords. Qualified tenants are in high demand, especially right now in Ontario. We're in a bit of a softer rental market. So, it's basically, I'm going to just talk about how I do it for my clients. So Carmel, if you want to go to the next slide. Thanks. So here's some questions that I ask normally before I start working with a tenant to help them find a property, or if another agent contacts me and they want to, bring forth an offer from their tenant to lease my client's property. So I ask what they do for work, how many people are going to be living in the home. I ask if they have pets, especially for condos. Many condos, probably most condos, have some sort of restrictions and rules around pets, the types of pets you can have, how many pets you can have in a unit. It's not permitted in Ontario to not rent to somebody because they have a pet. However, it is permitted if the condominium corporation prohibits that type of pet. So there are condos in the GTA that are completely pet-free, and that supersedes any rights that the tenant has to have a pet. Now, of course, something like a seeing eye dog is an exception for this, but generally, those pet rules the condo corporations have kind of supersede everything else. You want to know what the move-in date is. You want to make sure that it lines up with when the unit becomes vacant. You want to kind of know what their credit score is. But usually, I have these conversations up front. So if you're a landlord, you're renting out your property, somebody reaches out to you on Facebook Marketplace, they want to see the property, I would go through these questions with them. At your comfort level. You may not be comfortable asking all of this, but just kind of telling them that, hey, if we're going to be moving forward, I'm looking for somebody that has a full-time job, can provide an employment letter, can provide 2 pay stubs, has a credit score that's about 700. My building doesn't permit pets. So this is kind of what I'm looking for. Does this seem like a fit for you? Like having that conversation up front can save you a lot of time from having to constantly drive to the property and show it to people. And then, you get their documents after, and it's not what you're looking for. Because I find that a lot of time when people kind of reach out to rent a property directly, like let's say if I'm just renting out my property myself, they present themselves, or they have like this story about how they're, this great tenant, they look after the property, all of that, but they kind of tiptoe around some of this subject matter. So I just kind of make them aware that, hey, like I'm not asking you to send me your credit report right now before you see the property. This is what I'm going to be looking for. So let's have this conversation now. Make sure that you're okay with this, so we don't both spend our time driving there, looking at this property, wasting time, and then it's a non-starter for both of us, right? And then just kind of like also see if everything makes sense. Like if they tell you that they've just been in their property for 6 months and they're looking to leave, or let's say they're telling you, oh, my lease is up, I'm moving out. Well, that's kind of like a red flag for me, because in Ontario, that makes no sense. Your lease is not up. After a year, your lease goes month to month. So there's no such thing as like you have to move out after a year. So that's something where, I usually just ask questions. So I treat it like an interview. I want to make sure that it kind of passes the smell test for me. And, I want to kind of satisfy myself before I drive out and show somebody a property. But everybody kind of has to work within their own comfort level. For somebody who's maybe kind of getting into this or newer or not asking these type of questions, at least maybe even getting their email address and then sending them a list of documents. And then before you go for the showing, to show them your home, saying like, hey, I sent you an email. Did you read it? Is it okay? Is everything okay with you? This is what I'm going to require. I don't want to have you come out and then it doesn't work because you're missing something. Does that make sense, Carmela?
Alex, that all makes sense. And again, you do this obviously before the property is you show the property, right? You're just trying to get that, again, that the sense if they're on the same page, if they're what they're interested in, and you also set the expectations.
Yeah, exactly. And I always like to have a conversation with them as well, right? Like jump on a phone call, 5-minute phone call. You can identify a lot. You can feel out the person. You can see like, is this somebody that I would want to live in my property? Like, how's our communication going? Are they like talking over me and bullying me throughout the conversation? Or is this, somebody who seems to be quite receptive? Now, I mean, they may be putting on a show for you because they're trying to impress you, but yeah, like generally, whether it's, I'm renting out my own property, somebody reaches out to me to rent it, or I am, somebody reaches out to me as a prospective tenant that wants me to work with them as a real estate agent, or if somebody reaches out to me like another agent and they want to lease out my client's property, or they see the listing on realtor.ca and they just reach out to me directly and they want to work with the listing agent. I kind of go through all of this, make sure like there's nothing illegal or anything like that about asking these questions. I'm not, I'm just basically just kind of being upfront with them to not waste their time.
Hey, Alex, it makes perfect sense to kind of pre-screen, right? Because if somebody doesn't have 5 minutes for a phone call, they're clearly not, that serious when it comes to looking to rent this place. So.
Or if they don't want to answer these questions.
Yeah.
I mean, like, okay, if you can't bother to answer these questions, I'm like, that's fine. But, that just tells me that there's going to be a painful tendency. And if somebody's difficult to deal with from the onset, like that can give you an indication of what they're going to be like when they're moving in the place, right? Like, I'll talk about today's favor, tomorrow's duty a little bit later, but you do want to make sure that as a landlord, you set boundaries with your tenant around what you're going to be doing and not doing, to just kind of make sure that you're on the same page from the get-go, because today's favor is tomorrow's duty. But anyways, these are the documents that I request. I have, if you want a copy of the rental application form, we have a standard form in Ontario, it's a form 410. Feel free to reach out. I know Carmelo is going to share some contact information after for both of us. But yeah, this is what I look for. So I look for rental application, employment letter and pay stubs, government ID, full credit report. I don't want to just see like a screenshot off their phone. I want them to download the whole Equifax report and send it to me. And one of the services that I offer to my clients when I'm representing them as their agent to lease out their property is that I also do my own credit check on the tenant through my brokerage as well, just to make sure that they're not sending me a Photoshop credit report. I make sure that everybody who's over the age of 18 that's residing in the home, I ask for these documents, unless there's like some reason not to ask for, like, let's say one of the people is like retired and they're not working. I'd want some verification. I'd want their government ID. Like, I'd want to see who these people are. But, in that case, I can't really ask for like an employment letter if they're retired, right? But so there are some exemptions to this, but generally everybody who's over the age of 18, I request this. And I do send them kind of like an email, like I mentioned, saying like, this is the rental application. This is everything I need. I request it all before the showing, before we, go to see the property. I make sure I touch base with them like, hey, I sent you everything. This is what I'm looking for. Do you have any questions? Is this going to work for you? And then I move forward. I mean, I have been burned a couple of times where people said like, hey, yeah, that's all fine. And then they start telling me in the showing, oh yeah, my credit is this and that. But I would say that 8 out of 10 times, they understand that I know what I'm looking for, and they're also not going to spend their own time going if they don't meet those requirements, or they'll at least tell me about that up front and maybe give me some reasoning behind it. Like sometimes a lower credit score, especially if maybe somebody's younger or they don't have a lot of credit history, that can be explained quite easily. And sometimes that's okay. Like maybe they just came to Canada a year ago and they have one credit card. But I want to kind of know what is the backstory about it. If they have like a credit score below 700, I want to know why, what's on there, and make sure that I'm comfortable with it. And if I'm representing my client, the landlord, I would also like connect with them first and say like, okay, this is the story. Is this somebody you would even consider? And if they tell me no, I would never disclose the reason why to the tenant, because I don't want them to like, be like, oh, you're discriminating against me because of a prohibited ground or something like that. But I would just, just say like my client asked me not to move forward, and that's it.
Good points, Alex. And again, when it comes to credit reports, you mentioned it a few times, and I kind of really want to give some examples. It's not about the credit score; it's about the report. Working with mortgages, I work with a lot of people, and even I'll speak with regards to the story with regards to my current investment property. Right, a credit score, you could get a credit score of 800, over 800, which everyone would think, wow, over 800, that's an extremely high credit score. But that I do see credit scores over 800 where people have a vehicle with payments of 700-800 per month and an additional 10, 20, 50,000 unsecured, credit cards, lines of credits above and beyond, their current obligations. So if they're going to be paying rent and they got a $700 car payment, on $50,000 of unsecured credit, that's about another $1,000 per month. Can they actually afford this place afterwards?
Yeah.
And the opposite is, sorry, Alex, you want to continue with
that?
No,
go ahead. I'm going to jump in after you're done.
The opposite is, when I bought my investment property with my partners, we inherited the existing tenants. And if we looked at their credit reports right at that time, and we had to filter them, one of them had lower credit score. But the reason was he got separated, and the ex put him under the rug, and credits went bad. The person's never missed a payment in 4 years. So if you look at just only the number and not look at the story, you may be missing out on good tenants.
Yeah, you want to kind of see everything, but also like, Carmelo, you touched on a really valid point here. Is like they might have great credit, but with all the payments that they're making, can they afford the rent? And then like, let's say there's an emergency that comes up, or maybe they get laid off and they're looking for a new job. Is the rent going to be late, right? So like something that, like a rule of thumb that usually we go with is we want the rent to be about 30 to 40% ratio of the earnings.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like that's, and it's difficult in Toronto because the rents have increased so dramatically over the last 3 years, especially. But that's like generally the consensus is 30-40% is kind of what the market is looking for as far as income to rent ratio.
Yeah, and that's you got to take it in stride, right? Because the rent's being so high, you may have high caliber tenants that maybe a little bit higher, maybe at 45, maybe 50. But they have no other expenses, no car loans, no car leases, no other outstanding debt. Where, okay, you know what? If they don't have any other bills, can they afford, 45, right? You can't just, these are not hard numbers. So everything's case by case.
Yeah.
Moving along, Alex.
Yeah. So when I do the background check, I don't just focus on the tenant. I focus on everything else that they're providing. So like, when I look at the rental application, I look at the references somebody's going to provide. Nobody's going to, well, some people do, but most people are not going to provide a landlord reference or a personal reference that's going to give them a bad reference. Like that just doesn't make any sense, right? So, I also want to make sure that I do a check on who it is that I'm checking with to confirm they are who they are. So, for example, for employment, if somebody gives me a phone number and says this is their manager, I'm not going to call that manager. I'm going to look up the company online. I'm going to find their phone number. I'm going to contact human resources for that company. I'm going to ask to speak to HR, say I'm doing an employment verification for this person, and that's how I'm going to go about it. I mean, I've had to do this even for where like it was kind of like a vicious circle where I had to call like the head office of a company like in the States, for somebody that worked in Toronto, like in a satellite office, and kind of go around and like get another phone number, another phone number, another phone number, or I'll call if they tell me that, hey, okay, like call, you know, Mike Smith, that's their supervisor, and that's the same person that's on the application. I'll ask human resources to give me his phone number. I'm not going to just go on the phone number. I've had before where I've, you know, I used to work in an industry where we did a lot of recruitment and selection, and that's kind of where a lot of my thoughts around doing these background checks came from, where I had people that they would like list, you know, they would say, this is my supervisor from work. I'd call that person, they wouldn't answer. It would be a totally different name on the voicemail, and then they call me back and then they say like they are who was put on the application, but I'm like, well, obviously this is a lie, right? So you know, generally people lie. I've also have found you know, just fake fraudulent documents floating around several times actually when I've represented landlords, where there's a company, I forget the company's name, but when I see their letterhead, I remember right away. They had like a 1-800 number set up, they had an answering service, they had a website, everything was very professional. But through doing reverse Google searches, I was able to find that the human resources person that they put was not a real person at all. The picture was an AI generated picture of a man, and this company didn't actually exist. So you know, this is something where, you know, several times we've kind of saved our clients from getting these tenants in, because these were employment letters that had really high incomes on them, all in the IT sector. And you know, I don't know what the intention was. Maybe these people were intending to pay rent and do all of that stuff, but at the same time, you know, that's it's just like, you know, they're providing fraudulent employment documents. So it's an incredibly dangerous situation to get somebody like that into your property. You know, the space that I used to work in, we had a case where, and this is before real estate, a case where there was this lady, her name was Elizabeth. This was actually in the news. She would go into properties with fake documents, get the lease, get the property, rent the property out on Airbnb, stop paying rent, and continuously go and get more properties and do that and generate money through renting it out on Airbnb and not paying rent to her landlord, and just refuse to leave the unit until she was evicted, which can take up to a year in Ontario. So, you know, through this, I saw like what are the real dangers of kind of, you know, not properly pre-screening tenants, and that's why I have all these extra steps that I do. So I do Google, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn searches. You know, I look at even like on their Facebook, like who their friends are, who they're following, what groups they're in. If it says on the rental application they have no pets, but then they have a picture of them and their dog, that's a huge red flag. Like any inconsistencies, things that don't make sense. I don't call the most recent landlord because they probably want to get this person out of their property, so they're going to give you a great reference. I call the landlord before that. I also go onto Geo Warehouse, which I have access to as a real estate agent. It's basically the title registry office, and I make sure that the person who I'm speaking to is actually on title as the owner of that property. I mean, I've had all of this type of stuff come up before, where information was inconsistent and everything looked good on paper, but then when we start digging, we find all these holes and gaps, and it just doesn't make sense. Your spidey sense start going. You're just like, something's off here, and if it doesn't smell right, just don't move forward with it. So just a little bit about that and doing background checks. If you want to go to the next slide, or do you have something to say, Carmelo?
I just want to reinforce what you're saying again. You know, doing a lot of work up front to save a lot of pain down the road. You know, with social media and the internet today, almost every single person in one form or another is on the web, and there are a few people that really don't use social media or, you know, a lot of these other accounts. However, their employer most likely would be on somewhere on the net. Like if that employer didn't have a www dot, you kind of question that employment that they have.
I mean, even having a domain is like, doesn't really mean anything, but you know, like that's why generally I always recommend like public, like not public companies, but companies that, like, let's say they have like 500 plus employees on LinkedIn, for example, right?
Yes.
Like companies that definitely exist, are real, they're in business. I don't recommend unfortunately for my clients to move forward with like these startups where there's like 2 people working there, and like they're here today and they're there tomorrow. Like that's not a stable job in my opinion, as much as it may be a high paying job and maybe they can pay the rent. But I just find things like this as being too risky. Or if somebody's just been at their job for like 2-3 months, too risky, unless they've been working in this industry for a long time.
Exactly. So
yeah. Sorry, my thing. Yeah. So yeah, if tenants want to use a guarantor, I mean, this does come up a lot. I always pre-screen a guarantor as a tenant. I also just recommend putting them on the lease, because really, like, a guarantor is only there for the duration of the original lease. So after the lease is done, the guarantor is off, and you just have a tenant. So like, the guarantor has to make sense. If it's like a university student and their guarantor are their parents, that makes sense. That's perfectly fine. No concerns there. But if it's like a grown adult and they have some like friend who's a guarantor, like, forget it. Like, I don't move forward with that. But if you decide to, that's up to you. Just like make sure you do a very deep check on them, and you look not just like at their ability to, sorry, my light keeps going off. And you look not just like at their ability to, like, they have to be able to pay their own bills and be able to pay the lease if this tenant stops paying. So like, it's not very strong. So like, for an adult to use a guarantor and like that person having no relation to them, I mean, like, really, guarantor is only for university students as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, at university, that makes perfect sense, Alex. But again, the university student won't have a lot of credit history in performance or anything like that. It's they're going to school, right? That's their job, so it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and I mean, like, the guarantor, like, what are you going to do? You're going to sue them? Like, if they don't pay, like, come on, like, it's going to be just, it's not like, it's too much. So tenant rights, make sure you're in the know. So the Residential Tenancies, I don't know why this light keeps going off, but the Residential Tenancies Act has, just trying to check this in the back here. Residential Tenancies Act has a lot of great information on there. You can get standard documents. There's scenarios. They tell you exactly what the rights are. You can Google, you can search Residential Tenancies Act rent increase, and it will come up for you. We'll tell you exactly what the rules around that are and give you examples. You make sure that you have a paralegal that you can, reach out to, or maybe like some Facebook groups for landlords where you can ask questions. Why does this keep happening? Maybe this is why something's wrong here. Anyways, and then yeah, laws do change. So make sure that you are up to date with that, and you kind of do a check when you're dealing with a situation. Don't rely on like, hey, I dealt with it 2 years ago and this is what the law was. Double check that nothing has changed. But you can get stuff like the Ontario Standard Lease on the website. Carmelo, next slide. And yeah, a lot of other documents. But the Ontario Standard Lease is a required document. As a landlord, you are required to provide that for your tenants. They can actually ask for it, and then if you don't provide it, they can withhold rent for up to 1 month until you do provide the Residential Tenancies the Ontario Standard Lease. So make sure that you do that. It's a landlord's responsibility. It sets out the terms of the tenancy, for example, who pays what utilities. And then some additional terms you may want to mention in there is like if the tenant's responsible for exterior maintenance, if there's any special parking requirements, identify things like minor repairs. I always put things like the tenant will be responsible for changing light bulbs or unclogging the sink, because really, today's favor becomes tomorrow's duty. So that this is one thing I want to mention is that, if from the onset you start doing things like changing light bulbs or unclogging the sink for your tenant, well, they're going to be calling you every single time a light bulb needs to be changed, and you do it all the time. So like, I usually have a schedule that I provide with the lease that kind of identifies that, like, hey, you can't sublet this unit without my permission. There's no short-term rentals or Airbnbs. The only people that are going to live here are the ones that are on the lease. And then it also mentions things like, who's responsible for maintenance or small items. The key deposit is also identified in the lease. It should be a reasonable amount, which is for the cost of replacing the keys. If there's any special rules around parking, that's also in there. A lot of landlords, for some reason, ask for post-dated checks. I don't know why they asked for this. Post-dated checks are not guaranteed in any way. If you go to cash that check and the person has no money in their account, nothing is really going to happen. So it's not legal to ask for this. I don't recommend anybody asks for post-dated checks anyways. E-transfer is fine. I mean, you can set out something in your lease that says e-transfer by 12 p.m. on the 1st of the month. So you're all on the same page when you're going to get it. Also, prepaid rent above first and last months is also not permitted. If you ask for it as part of the person getting the unit, they can actually move in and ask for it back. So don't ask for additional rent. I would never allow additional months of rent up front to overlook the tenant's profile. Like, let's say it's a really bad profile, but they're giving you a year of rent up front. There's a lot of landlords that would jump on this. I think this is stupid because after the year, they're still living in your unit. So, okay, whatever. They paid for the year up front, but you're stuck with this person as your tenant that you would not consider otherwise. First and last is the best way to go, in my opinion. Unless, I mean, it's like a really competitive situation. Maybe, you have like 5 offers, everybody's great, and then somebody voluntarily says, okay, I'll give you a couple of more months or maybe $50 above the rent or something like that so that you go with me. If you would consider this person, if they were only giving you first and last at the asking rent and they're asking you above that, maybe consider that, but never, make it a condition that, hey, I'm going to hold out until somebody offers me 6 months rent up front, because you're going to be stuck with a really crappy tenant after the 6 months. And also damage deposits, pet deposits, they're not illegal in Ontario. Sorry, they're not legal in Ontario. You can't ask for that. Sometimes people do, especially when it's a furnished unit. Generally, with furnished units, tenants do kind of understand this, but again, you cannot ask for pet deposits or damage deposits in Ontario. In Alberta, you can, but that's another presentation about why I started to invest in Alberta. And maybe I'll do one in the next couple of weeks, because their Residential Tenancies Act is a lot different than Ontario's. Yeah, Carmelo, anything you want to add in here?
I want to add, I guess, Alex, again, when it comes to like the filter, that's something you may want to be where you could, can we set it up where we go in it ourselves? Because that's kind of a cool way to kind of let the tenants know that you're going to come. You're not going to inspect the property. You're just going to do a maintenance thing to the property, but it gives you the hands-on every 6 months to see if they're really taking care of the property.
100%. But also, I mean, you don't have to just do that. Your landlord insurance policy is going to stipulate that you need to go in and check the property as a landlord. So you can just like tell them like, hey, my insurance policy says I have to come here every 6 months and check the property. If I don't do that and something happens, my insurance might be void. So I got to follow that. So always turn to process, not personality. I'm not coming in here because I want to check what you're doing. There's a process. I have to follow the process. I'm following the rules, what says in my insurance. I'm a by the book kind of guy. So I'm going to come here every 6 months. Maybe you're not going to come every 6 months, but yeah, changing the air filter. I mean, that's a good one. If there is an air filter, but condos don't have an air filter to change. Air filter is generally for homes.
Well, yeah, you're right. Like, my condo does have an air filter. So
if you have the furnace in your unit, yeah, it does.
Yeah.
But the ones that have a fan coil, the building takes care of that.
Yeah. So it's case by case. But again, if you can find it's not really a sneaky way, but a way to kind of always, every 6 months, it's always good just to kind of go into it. And even then, if I know someone's coming to visit my house or look at my house, they'll always tidy up that little extra bit, right? Are they taking care of the place?
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, yeah, but always turn to process.
Yeah, process is more important. Like if you have like, again, your home insurance, the landlord insurance requires you visit once a year. Just put in there, you let them know up front. Yeah. And then once a year, you check it out.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, these people are your clients, right? Like, they're paying you every single month. They're helping you pay for your investment. So you don't want them to feel like, you're like watching everything they're doing, right? They want their own privacy as well. And you wouldn't want somebody coming in and checking your place every 6 months. So make sure or maybe you would, I don't know, but make sure it's reasonable. Turn to process, give them the privacy, give them the respect. It's a two-way street. You got to kind of like respect each other, but yeah, like, you do want to check your property, within reason, without making them feel uncomfortable about it.
Well said, Alex.
Yeah, annual rent control, rent increases. Some people may not be aware of this. So basically, there is rent control in Ontario. The government does set out what the maximum rent increase can be every year. This year was 2.5%. 2025, I think, is going to be 2.5% again. However, any unit that was occupied for residential purposes after November 15th, 2018, is not subject to rent control. So the landlord can essentially just like increase the rent to whatever amount they want, usually it will be whatever market rent is. So that's why it's important, if you have a new unit, to have a resource that you can kind of like reach out to and be like, hey, time to do the rent increase. What forms do I fill out? What's the market rent in my building? Can you let me know? because also depending on how the rental market is, you don't want to increase it so much that your tenant moves out, and then it might be difficult sometimes to find a good tenant. Like the market that we're in right now for rentals in Toronto is very much like a tenant's market. Like it's challenging for landlords to find good tenants, especially if they have an expensive property.
Yeah. Alex, how much notice do you have to provide the tenant with regards to a rent increase?
90 days, but it should be 90 days on the from the anniversary of the rent. So if they pay the rent on the first of the month, and let's say they moved in December 1st, that means that you should be providing notice to them before September 1st. If you provide the notice to them after September 1st, it's already not 90 days. It'll be 90 days from October 1st, meaning that the rent increase should be like it was already now for January 1st.
So it's 90 days or more.
90 days or more. I mean, you can tell them 6 months ahead if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do it 100 days. You could do 4 months in advance, and so you have like a 30-day window to.
You can tell them maybe the year before.
Well, not so, if you're just getting them in the door, you don't want to tell them, hey, guess what? A year from now, this is your rent increase.
Well, yeah, but I mean, they would anticipate it. I mean, like, you know, there are tenants out there that are like, I want to live only in the rent-controlled unit. So if you tell them every year I'm going to increase the rent 2.5%, that's, you know, like they kind of expect it. And there's a special form that you're supposed to use for this. I mean, you can use like email if you want, but it's not, you know, if something goes sideways, it's not the appropriate way to do it. So I have the special form on the next slide, Carmelo, if you can do me the favor and click it. It's called an N1. It kind of just goes through everything. You can get them to sign it electronically or by hand. And if you go onto the Residential Tenancy Board website, they have all these forms. So if you go next slide. Oh, no, sorry, it'll be in a couple of slides, but it'll show you like all the stuff that's on there, all the forms, rent increase and tenancy, all of that. I recommend that you always use the government's forms for doing this stuff. Don't make your own lease. Don't make your own rent control document. Don't make your own end of tenancy document. Just use what the government has because it's enforceable under the tribunals, right? So like, you know, that way, you know, you kind of know that you've covered all the bases and you've filled everything out properly, and it even gives you information for the tenant on how to complete the forms. Yeah. So just some final tips. So when the tenant moves in, I always do a walkthrough with them. I inspect the unit, I document everything, I show them everything, make sure everything is working. Monica, I'll get to your question at the end, if that's okay. So yeah, I inspect the unit, I walk through the unit, document any deficiencies. If there's like emergency valves for shutting off the water, which there are in every home, you want to make sure you identify where it is and you kind of document, maybe take a picture of it and email it to them and be like, hey, Carmelo, when we did the walkthrough, I showed you the water shut off under the kitchen sink. It's just a reminder, here's the photo. You know, have them confirm and sign everything, take a picture of the keys that you're giving them or write out the keys. You know, get a copy of their tenant insurance before they move in. And like, let's say, Carmelo, your lease starts on October 1st, but I'm a nice guy. I'm going to give you the keys on September 25th. I want to make sure that your rental insurance starts on September 25th, because if something happens during those 5 days during your move-in, you're potentially not going to be covered. So you need to have a landlord policy, and your tenant has to have a tenant policy. So landlord policy basically also protects you in the event that, let's say, your tenant cancels their policy and doesn't tell you and then something happens. But the tenant policy protects you from having any claims if the tenant causes damage to the unit. So let's say Carmelo leaves the bathtub running. Sorry, I keep using it as an example, but you flood the unit underneath. Now they will go after your insurance to repair that. It's not going to impact my insurance as a landlord. And the same thing, you know, if there's some fire that happens, it protects the tenant's personal belongings as well. So everything, even if you're renting a room or a basement, make sure that your tenant gets an insurance policy. The best recommendation is you should have at least $1 million in liability. And also the key deposit should also be provided before the tenancy starts as well.
Yeah, no, it's all good examples. And again, that insurance is extremely valuable. A lot of people don't know about tenant insurance. Yeah. And the rent places out and all of a sudden something happens, right? So you want to be responsible and pay for something that someone else has done. Yeah,
and you also want to make sure you let your insurance company know and make sure you have the right coverage for yourself as a landlord as well, because it's no longer, you know, the purpose of that property has now changed. You're not using it yourself anymore. Somebody else is using it, so you want to make sure you're covered for everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, like I mentioned before, Landlord Tenant Board website has lots of different forms on there that you can just download. So don't create your own forms. There's forms for ending tenancy. So like if the tenant tells you, hey, I'm going to move out, and they need to provide you 60 days notice for that, get them to sign the N4. Oh, sorry, not the N4, the N11, the agreement to end tenancy. That way, if something comes up and they maybe don't move out, you have something that's enforceable. Same thing, like there are other forms there, like if the tenant is late on, like didn't pay their rent. There are forms that you can go through. Like if you start to have challenges, like let's say it's the first of the month, the tenant hasn't paid rent, you reach out to them and they're ghosting you or they're giving you excuses, you want to get in touch with your paralegal as quickly as possible to start going through the steps that are required to, go after this person towards, because you don't want to be like behind the ball on this. You want to be very on it. And I mean, I'm not trying to like scare anybody. I know that like in the news, there's a lot of different articles. Unfortunately, they don't do news reports like, hey, guess what? 99.9% of tenants paid their rent on time this month. You only hear about the, 0.01%, and everybody gets really scared and paranoid because of that. Unfortunately, the Residential Tenancies Act is heavily favored towards tenants, it seems like. I think it's just something that maybe when it was created, there was a lot of bad landlord practices and it was put into place to protect people. But just as the environment changed, they never adapted the laws. And it's an election issue. Whichever way they decide to go on it, they're going to lose votes. So they rather focus on paper bags at the LCBO than, real items. But like it is what it is, work within the environment. But I think most people are good people. Like they just want to pay their rent, pay their bills, look after their family. So don't go into it with a mindset like everybody's out to screw me, but make sure you're doing the things up front to try and identify the ones that are. And if situations happen, you have some resources, whether that's a real estate agent, whether that's a paralegal, whether that's a landlord Facebook group, where you can go and you can ask questions and you can talk to people and you can kind of get information on best practices. But Facebook groups are great. I get a lot of information from there as well, but ultimately, you can't really rely on everything you get there. You don't know who these people are. They're not professionals. They may be just giving you their opinion. So the best bet is to have just a paralegal, and a good paralegal shouldn't charge you to answer like a simple question.
And Alex, again, with all these forms, wouldn't it be very beneficial? Like if you did have to go to a tribunal, you provided that N4 saying there was non-payment on this.
Yeah, you need to provide all that stuff. Otherwise, you're never going to even get there. They're going to ask you, okay, did you give the N4?
Yeah.
Did you give them the notice about the non-payment of rent? Like, where is that? There's a process that you have to go through, right? So you can get there. And then you don't want to like waste time. And then, I had a situation of a friend of mine. He was telling me that, when he started getting kind of like investment properties, he rented out a property, somebody stopped paying rent. He started going through the process of evicting them. The person came to him 6 months later, gave him a bunch of cash. He accepted it. And then stopped paying rent again. Well, guess what? At this point, the whole process has now started from the beginning because he accepted some rent from these people.
Yeah.
So so final tips, make sure that you do maintain a good relationship with your tenants. They are essentially your clients. Pick your battles. There might be small things or small requests that they make that are just like, it might be just easier to accommodate it rather than get into a fight with them about it or a big, pissing match. Like pick your battles. But remember that today's favor is tomorrow's duty. So if you go and you do something for somebody once, the expectation is you're going to continuously do it for them again. I had a client where she went and changed the light bulbs for her tenants, and she called me and she was like, oh, the light bulbs weren't working, and I went and changed. I'm like, well, guess what? Every time the light bulbs burn out, you're going to be going to change those light bulbs now. Yeah. So, you're not like, this is not a hotel at the end of the day. Like you're required to make sure that they have a safe place to live in, everything works. But, if they damage it themselves, you should hold them responsible for it. And don't go above and beyond here, because they're just going to be like, you're going to become like a cleaning lady for them at the end of the day. Benchmark and document everything that happens. The tenant gives you a call and tells you something, send them an email after, hey, as per our conversation, this and this happened, this is the steps I took, thank you very much. Make sure so that way you have everything in writing. text messages are okay, but it's not proper benchmarking. The best is to email, photos, all of that. When you go and inspect the unit, take some pictures, send them to yourself. That way you have proof. If the insurance company ever comes up, you can say like, hey, I emailed myself. And you go into your email and say, okay, September 15th, I sent myself an email. Went to 123 Main Street, did the walkthrough. Here's some pictures of the unit. And then January 1st, went to 123 Main Street, did the walkthrough. Here's some picture of the unit. Emailed it to myself. This benchmarks it. You have a timestamp. Like nobody can dispute and say like, oh, you didn't actually go there. Make sure you get landlord insurance, and then you understand like rent control, rent increase. But ultimately, try to go into it with like a positive mindset. Like don't, if you get what you look for in this universe. So if you're looking for everybody to be screwing you, then that's where you're going to find. But I think ultimately, like, where everybody's a little bit hypersensitive now because of all the stuff in the media. So, a lot of it is rightful. Like the stories I'm hearing are pretty disgusting, but at the same time, it's just a very small percentage of people. And a lot of times when I have discussions with people about, these tenant issues that they have, and I ask them about what happened to get these tenants into the place in the first place, you're like, well, that's a red flag, that's a red flag, that's a red flag. Like the red flags all over the place. But maybe the person is just a little bit desperate because they're like getting anxious. They're like, hey, the first of the month is coming. I got to pay my mortgage. I don't have a tenant in there. Okay, let's just put this person in there. They seem okay. Well, sometimes it's better to wait a month, than to have a situation like that. So yeah, question. So we have a question from Monica.